Good morning, everybody. Uh, as I put in my email, I am recording this on Sunday. So by the time you probably watch this, it'll be actually Monday. And as I put in my email, the reason is on Monday, I'm actually getting my kitchen and dining room redone. So instead of having hammering and demolition sounds in the background, I thought it would be more efficient to record this the day before. So hopefully this works out for everybody. And if there's any other questions, feel free to reach out and I will help you out. We're still going to have class on Wednesday, so hopefully I can answer any questions then. So as we go to kind of get into this, we are talking about specific learning disabilities. In the book, it's chapter 5, it's just learning disabilities. However, we are talking about specific learning disabilities in Ohio, okay? So some of the things I want you to think about this week as we kind of go through this. Why has the concept of learning disabilities proven so difficult to define? What characteristics encompasses all students with learning disabilities? What factors might account for the huge increase in the prevalence of students with identified with learning disabilities since the category was officially recognized in the mid-1970s? Are the achievement deficits of most students diagnosed with learning disabilities as a result of neurological impairment or poor instruction? Also, what can a student responsiveness to evidence-based instruction reveal about the need and focus of special education? How can academic tool skills and learning strategies relate to each other? And what skills are most important to the success of an elementary age student with learning disabilities in the general education classroom or for a secondary student? All right, so what is a specific learning disability? And the IDEA definition of specific learning disability, and by the way, they use the term in our book LD. In Ohio, we say SLD, okay, it's a specific learning disability. So a specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes involved in the understanding or using of language. May manifest itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. So, what does this kind of look like? What kind of conditions are we talking about? Well, it includes perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and we're coming back to that, and developmental aphasia. So, dyslexia, though, let's go over dyslexia. Next year, the 23-24 school year, Ohio is implementing a dyslexia screener that is mandatory for all students, right? So it's mandatory for all students. Now, the state expects that this screener will help identify more students with dyslexia. So we expect that students qualifying for SLD may increase because of this new screening tool. For years, we obviously have tested students for dyslexia, but only when we suspected it. This is no longer going to be the case. We're going to do screening tools on all students, and anybody that screens positive for dyslexia, we will then test. So we expect to be able to actually identify more students. Back to SLD as a whole, this does not include learning problems that are the result of other disabilities or environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. Moving forward. So, most states require the 3 criteria to be met to receive services. First off, a discrepancy between intelligence and achievement. So an unexpected difference between general ability and overall achievement. Generally, this is a student that may have below average IQ, but their achievement is far below, especially in one of the criteria. I'm going back for a second. uh, especially like once again, average to below average IQ, but there's a specific area in their ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. So IQ is average, but let's say their mathematical calculation skills are really, really low. And that means there is an unexpected difference between the general ability and achievement. Some exclusion criteria. The student's difficulties are not the result of another known condition that can cause learning problems. So generally, if a student has another disability or something else going on, they normally won't qualify for specific learning disabilities. Most of the time. There also has to be a need for special education services. So the student shows specific and severe learning problems despite standard educational efforts. And we'll talk about that more. Obviously, the biggest issue that we're going to be looking for is, like all students in all categories, we're going to be asking ourselves, does a student have an impairment that negatively impacts their academic performance? And we're going to go over this a little bit more as we kind of get into this, but we got to always ask ourselves that, and we got to kind of rule out some other things that could possibly be the problem, such as maybe poor instruction. So just keep that in mind. So RTI, response to intervention. A local education agency may use a process that determines if the child responds to scientific research-based intervention as part of the evaluation procedure. I can tell you in Ohio, we have to do that. The RTI approach shifts the identification of learning disabilities from a wait to fail model to one of early identification and prevention. We've talked about RTI a lot. We'll probably talk about it more here today, but we do use RTI a lot for these students who may struggle. So there's a group, the NJCLD, that believes the federal definition of learning disabilities contains several weaknesses. First off, it believes that the exclusion of adults can be a weakness. So learning disabilities can occur across the lifespan. Reference to basic psychological processes. This is a curricular issue concerning how to teach and not a definitional one. Inclusion of spelling as a learning disability. Spelling can be basically considered under a written expression issue. It also includes obsolete terms, which basically means they're difficult to define. And they were of the exclusion clause. So they basically the suggestion that learning disabilities cannot occur with other disabilities. This group does not like that. So keep all of that in mind. This group's definition of LD, a general term that refers to a group of disorders manifested by significant difficulties in the acquisition and use of listening, speaking, reading, writing, reasoning, or mathematical abilities. These disorders are intrinsic to the individual and presumed to be due to central nervous system dysfunction and may impair across the lifespan. Problems with self-regulatory behavior, social perception, and social interaction may coexist, but do not themselves constitute a learning disability. Although learning disabilities may occur with other handicapping conditions or with extrinsic influences, they are not the result of those influences. So that's that group's definition, but let's get into characteristics of specific learning disabilities. All right. Reading problems are 80% of all children identified. Now, when we say reading problems in Ohio, we break those into two different groups. There are reading fluency problems and reading comprehension problems. So reading fluency problems are basically those students that do not read in a smooth manner. If you give them a passage to read, throughout trying to read it. All right. Maybe they omit words. Sometimes they may add words. They have a lot of fluency issues, so they just cannot read smoothly. There's also reading comprehension. issues. So those are the kids that just don't understand what they just read. They may be able to read fluently, but they can't understand what they read. It's kind of proven that students that have fluency issues generally also have comprehension issues, just because they're working so hard to try to figure out how to, read a passage and sound out words and everything else, that they're not quite understanding what they read. So sometimes there is both fluency and comprehension issues. That is possible and actually pretty common. Other characteristics, deficits in written language. So they're going to perform lower than their age-matched peers, or typically developing peers, without disabilities across most written expression tasks. So, long story short, spelling's going to be one of those issues that may come up. Other written language issues, they forget capitalization. They don't understand proper nouns. They're not going to know punctuation, things of that nature. Underachievement in math. More than 50% have math IEP goals. So a lot of times, even though you generally need only one issue, in math, we kind of break it out into two areas, just like we do with reading. There's math calculation and math word problems, both of which are kind of defined categories. So we understand what word problems are. Math calculation is just how quickly and how can you answer basic mathematical questions that you should be able to do in your head, essentially. I'm watering it down, but that gives you a basic understanding. So with that being said, students that have a hard time with reading comprehension are probably also going to struggle with word problems, or even fluency issues with reading. They're probably going to struggle with math problems, word problems, that is. So that's something to think about. When it comes to math fluency, I know me personally, I see that as a very big issue, because even though every kid has a calculator in their pocket, because every kid has a cell phone, I still find it as a legitimate issue, because obviously at some point when our kids get older, if they go to a grocery store and they get a Snickers bar and they only have $5, they got to have some idea how much change they should expect to get back, or else they could get ripped off. So I see that more as a survival skill, to have some basic math fluency skills. So we focus, at least in my department, we focus on that a lot. Other things with specific learning disabilities, poor social skills. 75% have social skills deficits. I don't like that this one's involved, but attention deficits and hyperactivity could be included. But remember, if they have ADHD, they're not going to qualify for specific learning disability. They're going to actually qualify for OHI minor. They may also have some behavioral problems, but generally, so there's two ways to look at this. There's two ways to look at behavior. We can look at behavior as, and we have to ask ourselves, is a behavior causing the academic issues? So is a behavior getting this kid kicked out of class so often that they're missing academic time? Or is the academics causing the behavior? So, and I mentioned this before, but there's some students that would rather be viewed by their peers as being bad instead of stupid. A lot of times I find that being the case. These kids are struggling, so they want to avoid the task that they struggle with, especially in front of their peers, so they're going to misbehave to get away from that problem. We also know that there's low rates of self-esteem, self-efficacy, lower levels of self-efficacy, mood, effort, and hope with these students as well. The defining characteristics, though. Specific and significant achievement deficits in the presence of adequate overall intelligence. Once again, these students may have slightly below average IQs sometimes, but their learning gap is pretty significant. So basically, the performance gap becomes especially noticeable in handicapping in the middle and secondary grades. That's where we're really going to spot it. Probably as early as third grade, but it could come out a lot later. The difficulties experienced by children with learning disabilities, especially for those who cannot read at grade level, are substantial and pervasive and usually last across the lifespan. So that one group that kind of disagreed with the IDEA definition, they disagreed because the actual IDEA definition does not include the term across the lifespan, meaning basically after they graduate high school, there's very little in terms of accommodations that could be given to these students at other aged levels. However, they're trying to improve that. That's kind of the difference between IDEA and that group. So, specific learning disabilities is by far the largest of all special education categories. 42.3% of all school-age children with disabilities receive services under the specific learning disability category, and about 4% of the school-age population. Males with specific learning disabilities outnumber females by a ratio of 3-1. So there's definitely proportionally males compared to females. The rising incidence of children with specific learning disabilities led some scholars to suggest it be considered an epidemic. Some contend that too many low achievers have been improperly diagnosed as specific learning disabilities or as having it. So, we are going to get into this real quick. We're going to talk more about this, I believe, later on, either later on in this class or on Wednesday, depending on how much we get through today. However, we're going to talk about this because when we talk about how many kids are getting diagnosed, we have to look at the instruction that these kids are receiving. So, for example, I'm going to give you a real life example. We have a kid that was referred to me. They tried RTI and everything, and they gave a referral sheet for an evaluation to me for this student who was really behind in, well, several academic areas. However, this child, not this current school year, but last school year, had a huge like absenteeism was off the chart. There was some homelessness involved. They were jumping shelter to shelter. Mom could not get her daughter to school. Well, with that being said, we had to take a look at everything. Did the overall, did her absenteeism cause an academic, issue? Well, yes. I mean, I'm just throwing out numbers for confidential purposes, but let's just pretend that the child missed 50% of the days last school year. Not this school year, but last school year. I think we could all agree that missing 50% of the days is going to put her behind academically in a lot of different areas. So, is that a learning disability? Probably not, right? Because we could probably explain it. It was poor instruction, not because of the teacher, but she wasn't in school to receive that instruction. So things like that we have to take under consideration. And we'll talk about more of that later on. All right, so let's talk causes. So brain damage or dysfunction. In most cases, there's no evidence of brain damage. Neuroimaging research has been reasonably consistent in revealing functional and or structural differences in the left temporal lobe of the brain of individuals with dyslexia. Once again, dyslexia, we expect that there's going to be a large uptick next year in students that are going to qualify because of this new dyslexia screening. Educators should refrain from placing too much emphasis on theories linking learning disabilities to brain damage or brain dysfunction. There's also hereditary issues. There's growing evidence that genetics may account for at least some family links with dyslexia. And once again, the more that we test for dyslexia, we've had a lot of kids slip through the cracks with dyslexia over many years. With this new screening tool, we are hoping to catch more students that may have it and require more help. There also could be a biochemical imbalance. So most professionals give little credence to biochemical imbalance as a significant cause of or treatment of learning disabilities. So most professionals don't put a whole lot of weight into that basket of biochemical imbalance. Moving on, environmental factors. Impoverished living conditions early in a child's life and limited exposure to highly effective instruction probably contribute to achievement deficits. Just like I gave you that example before, sometimes not getting a child to school is going to impact them. I think we can all agree on that. I think we can also probably all agree that, if you have and I should say this, but I will, if you have a poor teacher at a young age, that also could put you behind. So there's a lot of things that could kind of go into an environmental factor, but other things that they list is a tendency for learning disabilities to run in families, suggest a correlation between environmental influences on a children's early development and subsequent achievement in school. Many students' learning problems can be remediated by direct, intensive, and systematic instruction. So how do we identify these students? Well, we're going to use our normal intelligence test and achievement test. We're going to use these to measure the discrepancy between achievement and general intellectual ability. So, once again, kids going to probably come back average to maybe below average IQ. Achievement is going to be very, very low in at least one of the areas. We're also going to use curriculum-based measurement. So use to measure the growth of a student's proficiency and the core skills that contribute to success in school. At my school, we use iReady a lot. We use that to kind of measure growth. We're also going to use some direct daily measurement. So we're going to use for observing and recording a child's performance on a specific skill each time it is taught. We're also going to use some criterion reference test used to compare a child's score with a predetermined criteria or criterion. So basically, this is what the state average is. This is what the average is for students, across the nation. This is where that child is. It kind of gives us some idea where this child is at compared to the, national average or state average, depending on what type of, criterion reference test we're looking at. A lot of times we use, for that could be a standardized test. So let's talk about RTI with SLD students. So we know the basic premise of RTI is measuring low achieving students' response to increasingly intensive, scientifically validated instruction can determine whether the child's struggles to learn are the result of poor or insufficient instruction or of a disability for which special education is needed. We've gone over this before, but this is a good reminder. Two functions of RTI is screening, identification, and prevention. Trustworthiness of RTI depends on the consistent, rigorous implementation of RTI. Accurate, reliable, easy-to-use measures for monitoring student progress. So the first bullet point, let me go over real quick. Doing a research-based intervention for one day does not cut it. We have to do it over a period of time to really be able to assess the effectiveness of this intervention. So we got to do it over a period of time to really kind of measure it. When implementing RTI, primary tier 1 is good teaching. So we've talked about RTI before, so I'm kind of going to skim through this a little bit, but good reminder. So tier 1, that's just good teaching. If you remember the pyramid that we've showed multiple times, the pyramid, the bottom part of the pyramid is tier 1. That is good universal teaching. Primary prevention is provided to all students in the form of evidence-based curriculum and instruction in the general ed classroom. So this is things that we're doing for all students. Tier 2 is secondary intervention. This is the middle part of the pyramid. Students who are struggling in the Gen Ed program receive an intensive fixed duration trial of small group supplemental tutoring using a research validated program. So this is more small group based. Tier 3 is more intensive. Tier 3, this is wrong. Tier 3 is not special education yet. Tier 3 is the top of the pyramid. That's where we're doing one-on-one interventions. If tier 3 doesn't work, generally we then move on to special education. So this PowerPoint comes straight from the book, and I can tell you that in this case, the book is wrong. Benefits and goals of RTI. Earlier identification of students using a problem-solving approach instead of a wait-to-fail approach. So basically, this is why we use RTI. We also try to reduce the number of students referred for special education. We also tried to reduce in the over-identification of minority students. And we gave a provision of more instructionally useful data than those provided by traditional methods of assessment and identification. We increase the likelihood that students are exposed to high-quality instruction in the Gen Ed classroom by stipulating that schools use evidence-based instructional practices and routinely monitor the progress of all students. Finally, the service to all students with achievement problems so that only those students who fail to respond to multiple levels of intervention efforts receive the label of specific learning disabilities. So this is kind of why we do RTI. And it's supposed to help. I've always, one of my friends have always called RTI special education without the funding. And that's what it is. Because while schools don't get more funding for this program, we're hoping that putting these interventions in place, basically eliminate the need for the kid to be evaluated for special education. So if we find like a tier 2 intervention works, perfect. We just continue to do small group instruction, right? That's all we need to do. If that doesn't work, then we're going to go up to tier 3, one-on-one intervention. We're going to get some measurements there. If tier 3 still isn't working, that's when we normally get the referral to special education. So we're trying to reduce the number of kids that prematurely get, referred for an evaluation in special education. We're trying to reduce that. We're also trying to kind of eliminate the kids that maybe just are struggling because of a poor teacher, for example, or, things of that nature. We're trying to reduce that. All right, educational approaches. So how are we going to help these kids? Well, content enhancements are used to enhance the organization and delivery of curriculum content. So graphic organizers and visual displays, they're going to help almost all kids. So I recommend those to begin with. Note-taking strategies. I love guided notes. So if I was giving this PowerPoint to students, what I would do, if this was at a K-12 setting, I would give these PowerPoints to the kids. However, I would take out some words. So different things I would take out so they can just fill them out as we go along. That helps keep students more engaged. So guided notes is on here. Other note-taking strategies that I like to teach is when taking notes for other classes, for example, I always tell my students, you don't need to write down every word. You got to just focus on the important stuff. You start using some acronyms as you take notes. Even if no one else understands them, that's okay. Only you need to understand them. Different mnemonics help out as well. A learning strategy is an individual's approach to learning tasks. So students use task-specific strategies to guide themselves successfully through a learning task or problem. Now, generally, most of these kids are going to be able to succeed in a Gen Ed classroom. So in the 08-09 school year, 62% of these students were in a gen ed classroom. When research on academic achievement of students with LD in inclusive classrooms is overall mixed, though. A lot of times we try to put a, they're calling it a consultant teacher. It's an intervention specialist. So a special ed teacher. When we help them, put them with a gen ed teacher to work directly with these students, we see that it helps out tremendously. These intervention specialists work with several teachers and thus may indirectly serve many children. Most intervention specialists have little direct contact with students. That's not quite true. But they're talking about consultant teacher. In most schools in Ohio, we use an intervention specialist. They're going to work directly with the gen ed teachers to talk about different strategies. Also, because they're working with several different teachers, that intervention specialist can talk about things that have worked in other classrooms. So if a student is struggling in one class, but Miss Smith's class, the student is struggling, but in Mr. Jones' class, the student is doing very well, that intervention specialist can talk about what Mr. Jones is doing and talk about different strategies that we could try to put into Miss Smith's class, things of that nature. Also in the gen ed class with the intervention specialist, a lot of times we do some co-teaching. So maybe, there's several different models to how we do co-teaching. It could be splitting the classroom in half. So half the students go with the intervention specialist, other half goes with the gen ed teacher, and maybe there's some rotating between this. So they're both covering a little bit different materials, but in different ways. That's a good strategy. Other models may have a gen ed teacher teaching with the intervention specialist wandering throughout the room trying to help students that need more help. Things like that are going to be very beneficial to these specific learning disability students. Going back to placement, sometimes students with SLD need some time in a resource room. So, real quick, I'm not going to go over these stats, but I will say a lot of the students that I've worked with SLD, they do need some pull-out services. So we're going to pull them out of the gen ed classroom for a resource room for a very limited amount of time. Why are we doing that? Well, as you remember, when we went through the RTI process, we found that these students did not respond to just one-on-one intervention, right? Because that's tier 3. They didn't respond well to it. So we're still going to provide that one-on-one intervention. However, we're also going to provide accommodations for them, but also when in a one-on-one group in a smaller environment, we're able to work with them much more directly. So these students have a very noticeable delay in one of the areas. So we're able to directly work with these kids in that one area. So normally, I'm just throwing out numbers. Let's say they get 30 minutes of reading in a resource room. That's somewhat, 30 minutes a week in a resource room. That's fairly common for these students that may have some reading issues. Okay, that's fairly common. Most students, it has separate classrooms. So basically a self-contained classroom. Very few students who are SLD should need to be in a self-contained classroom. That just should not really happen that frequently. That should be very far and few between, because generally these students can still mostly, with help and accommodations, be serviced in a regular education classroom. Okay, that's fairly common, and that's where they should mostly be serviced. All right, moving on. That is all I had for today. We will talk about this more on Wednesday, and we will dive into this a whole lot more. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out by email or shoot me a text. That's fine as well. I will put all the things that we have due coming up in an email when I send this out. So if you have any questions with that, just let me know and I can help you out. But I will see all of you guys on Wednesday.